reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, and banishing those beliefs through which the greatest tumults take possession of the soul. For Epicurus, money really can't buy true happiness. The pleasures of fame and drugs and sex and food and even world travel are not really worthwhile. Indeed, Epicurus himself never married and was celibate. The only travel he did was for the purposes of learning and teaching. And he considered who you ate with and what you discussed while eating to be far more important than what you ate. Now, you don't have to be celibate like him, but you can attain true happiness. To do that, you have to rid yourself of a desire for physical pleasures, Epicurus says. This frees you from the worry and troubles they produce and thus enables you to pursue the cerebral pleasures that are worthwhile. Things like the study of philosophy. But even the knowledge Epicurus sought through his cerebral pleasures was simply a way to live a better life. Quote, "Of all the things which wisdom provides to make us entirely happy, much the greatest is the possession of friendship." End quote. Such knowledge could liberate you from the burdensome obligation of religion and superstition, and even from the fear of death and dying. Even though Epicurus died of a painful disease, he still counted his last day as a happy one because, as he put it, "the recollection of all my philosophical contemplation counterbalances all these afflictions." More importantly, once you realize that only pain is evil and fear-worthy, and that the state of being dead itself is not painful, you realize that death is nothing to fear. As he said, "Death is nothing to us, since when we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not." Nevertheless, Epicurean hedonism faces some serious objections. Since one determines the rightness or wrongness of one's own actions by whether or not they lead to the long-term attainment of worthwhile pleasures for oneself, this means that it can be acceptable to sacrifice the happiness of others to attain that goal. Now, this may not happen often, since you should be seeking friendship and cerebral pleasures, but still, in special circumstances, it can be perfectly acceptable, according to Epicurean hedonism, to be horribly selfish. For example, you wouldn't be obligated to care for a slowly dying loved one if doing so would pull you away from your cerebral pleasures and lead to an overall less happy life. But that seems wrong. Aren't we often obligated to act unselfishly and even sacrifice our happiness for others? It was objections like this that led the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham to develop the theory of utilitarianism. Now, he agreed with Epicurus that happiness was an intrinsic good and pain was an intrinsic evil. And even that the morality of an action should be determined by how much happiness and lack of pain it caused. As he put it, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. But he also thought that we are sometimes obligated to sacrifice our happiness, and indeed even suffer pain, for the sake of others. And so, he argued, the morality of an action should be determined by how much happiness and lack of pain it causes overall, for everyone, not just the person performing that action. Or as he put it, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So, if you're trying to figure out whether or not you should do some action, you should consider how much happiness and pain it will produce for everyone and compare that to how much happiness and pain not doing the action will produce for everyone, and whichever option would produce the most happiness and the least pain is the action you should do. Bentham called this hedonistic calculus, although to avoid confusion, we might call it utilitarian calculus, calculating the utilitarian worth of an action. No matter what you call it, the perfect example of it can be found, as usual, in science fiction. And again, in Star Trek, when Mr. Spock, at the end of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, sacrifices his own life repairing the Enterprise's warp drive to save the rest of the crew. He even invokes a utilitarian maxim to justify it. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Like Epicurus, Bentham's theory made sense in the context of the time he proposed it, in the late 1700s. It was a highly religious time in which social and sexual taboos greatly influenced both government and moral views. The fact that people found something distasteful or unnatural would be enough for them to declare it immoral or even illegal. But, Bentham thought, if an action doesn't hurt anyone, why should it be forbidden or immoral? Judging an action's morality based on its utility would have really gone against the grain at the time, but many tired of the oppression of the religious taboos would have found it refreshing. It's important to note, however, that Bentham's theory wasn't as simple as just figuring out how much happiness or pain an action will produce overall. When deciding how to act, you also had to be concerned about its intensity. Happiness is to intensity, its duration, its proximity to the action in question, how likely it would be to lead to other happiness or pain, its purity, how likely it would be that your action will have the intended results. But there is one thing that Bentham didn't consider. After such considerations are taken into account, Bentham still just tallies up the number of happy people and pained people, and then declares that whichever action produces the most overall happiness in the long run is the right thing to do. That is why it is often called quantitative utilitarianism. But the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill argued that Bentham missed an important distinction, one that he probably should have learned from Epicurus. There are higher and lower forms of happiness. There are the pleasures of sensation, the kind of pleasures that can also be experienced by animals, like eating and sex. And then there are the higher pleasures of the intellect that only humans can attain. Appreciating Beethoven, solving a complicated math problem, and perhaps most important of all, of course, doing philosophy. So, while Mill agreed that, quote, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce pain and the privation of pleasure, that morality should be defined according to, quote, the greatest amount of happiness altogether. Mill insisted that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. Quality, he argued, should be considered as well as quantity. This is why Mill's theory is often called qualitative utilitarianism. To distinguish the lower from the higher pleasures, Mill suggests you ask someone who has experienced both. Of two pleasures, he said, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experienced of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. Someone who has only experienced the lower pleasures may not appreciate or understand how these others can be more pleasurable. But if someone has experienced both, they will attest to the higher pleasures as leading to better forms of happiness. It's not that we should ignore the lower pleasures. If our options are simply between an action that will feed 5 or one that will feed 10, we should choose the latter. But when the higher and lower forms of happiness are in competition, we must give preference to the higher forms. We might say that, according to Mill, an action is morally best if and only if it maximizes overall the best kind of happiness available. At first glance, this seems like a pretty strong theory, and it is. But it is also, of course, subject to a number of objections and problems. First of all, it's not clear how solid of a truth maker it provides for moral statements. After all, once you do an action, it may be possible to figure out how much happiness that action caused. But what would make that action morally right is the fact that it produced more happiness than failing to do the action would have produced. But how can you really know how much happiness failing to do the action would have produced? Since you didn't actually fail to do it, you don't know what the results would have been. There is no state of affairs in the world that determines how much happiness failing to do the action would have produced. So, the truth of moral statements depends partly on the truth of counterfactuals. What would have happened had I not done what I did? But it's just as hard to find truth makers for counterfactuals as it is for moral statements. This leads to another objection. It's not clear how useful utility is for determining the rightness or wrongness of an action because it's difficult to determine how much happiness an action would produce. So you can never know whether you actually did the right thing. What's more, a good moral theory should tell you what the right thing to do is before you do it. But that means you would have to be able to predict the future regarding how much happiness your action will lead to. And really, there's no way to do that either. Now, I suppose you could make a decent guess in some cases, but most of the time it's hard to tell, especially if you need to factor in the long-term consequences of your action. So it's unclear how useful utilitarianism is as an ethical theory for deciding what you should do. At best, if we can figure out some account of counterfactuals, it seems that most of the time it could only tell you what you should have done after you act. What's more, utilitarian calculus is very difficult to do. Not only do you have to predict the future, but you have to weigh different amounts of happiness and different kinds of happiness against each other. Very easy when you talk in terms of 10 people being happy and 5 people being unhappy, but the world is rarely ever so clearly defined. Happiness doesn't really come in quantifiable units. Some have called them hedons, that you can really measure and test for quality and purity. And what about cases like this? Doing an action would make 100 people happy and cause 50 people pain. And not doing the action would cause 10 people to be happy and cause 5 people pain. One action causes more happiness, but the other one prevents more pain. So which one is preferable? Utilitarianism doesn't really tell us. What's more, utilitarianism doesn't seem to jibe with our moral intuitions. For example, suppose tomorrow there is a battle that will determine the fate of all humankind. One army wants to destroy the world and the other one wants to save it. Unbeknownst to anyone else, a clever secret agent puts a minefield underneath where the enemy army will be the next day and connects it to a remote. His plan is to detonate the mines tomorrow while the evil army is standing on top of them. But as he is walking away, the remote falls out of his pocket and lands on the ground and he can't find it. The next day, the battle is about to commence and a cowardly soldier in the back of the battalion of the good army decides to just cut his losses and go AWOL. He just takes off and runs for it. But in doing so, he happens to step on the lost remote and utterly destroys the evil army, thus saving the entire world. Now, clearly, the cowardly soldier's action led to more happiness overall. He saved the entire world. Yet, because the action was cowardly, it's difficult to label his action as moral. Or consider Shirley Jackson's story, The Lottery, where one person in a village is chosen to be sacrificed each summer so that a healthy harvest will grow in the fall. One person's death ensures the well-being of the entire community. Even if stoning one lottery victim did lead to more happiness overall, we would not say that it actually is moral. But we need not even go to outlandish thought experiments or fictional stories to discover counterexamples to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism seems to suggest that slavery could be moral. If a majority of people can make their lives easier and thus happier by enslaving a small minority of people and making them do all the dirty work that no one else wants to do, then that action produces more happiness overall. But clearly, it is immoral. So in general, we might say the problem is this. Like Epicurus, utilitarianism views happiness as the only thing that is intrinsically good in and of itself. But it's not. Fairness is also good, as is justice. Likewise, we may have duties to perform certain actions, perhaps because we have promised to or taken on a role that obligates us to. It seems that we should do such actions even as some other action could produce slightly more happiness instead. Likewise, people have rights that should not be violated even if doing so would bring about more happiness, like the right to not be enslaved. Or, as another example, one might attain civil rest by successfully blaming an innocent person for a crime, like everyone's demanding justice, and so you just blame someone so you can carry out the justice. But by doing so, you might prevent the worry that the killer is out there, but that wouldn't make it right to blame an innocent person. Now, utilitarians are quite aware of such objections, and some have tried to alter their theory to make it generate more intuitive results. Most notably, philosophers such as Richard Brandt and Brad Hooker have drawn a distinction between act utility and rule utility and advocated for the latter. Act utility is the kind of utility we've been considering so far, where the rightness or wrongness of an action is based on the consequences, the overall happiness that the action produces. So, if you give money to someone in need, but that poor person happens to be one of a very few who would use that money to get drunk and then kill someone, then giving them money was morally wrong. That action led to a lesser amount of happiness than refraining would have. But rule utility suggests that an action is right if it is done in accordance with, a rule that, if followed consistently, would maximize the overall amount of happiness. For rule utility, the question of how much happiness is produced should only be applied to general rules about action, not specific actions. So if you're trying to figure out what the moral thing to do in a specific situation is, you consider what rule you might be following by doing a particular action, and then ask yourself whether following that rule in general would maximize happiness. And if it would, then you should act on it. So let's say that most of the time giving money to the needy does lead to happiness. It enables them to feed themselves, their family, gives them a fighting chance. In general, following the rule, when I have the opportunity to give money to someone in need, then I will, leads to overall happiness. So, if you give money to someone in need, then it was the right thing to do, regardless of what that particular person does with the money that you gave them. Even if they get drunk and kill someone, it was still the right thing to do because in general, that kind of action leads to more happiness. I'm not doing justice to the full theories of Brandt and Hooker here, but that's the basic idea. Rule utility is aimed at avoiding the standard objections to act utility. Although one might be able to conjure up specific circumstances in which violating justice, fairness, rights, or obligations would generate more happiness, such violations generally lead to less happiness and thus, according to rule utility, are immoral. But a couple of problems still remain. First of all, it's not clear that in practice, rule utility doesn't just collapse back into act utility. To actually get it to work and get the right results, the rules you're acting on need to have exceptions embedded into them. For example, following the rule don't kill in general leads to more happiness overall. But there are exceptions. What about in self-defense? What about in a just war? What if you had a chance to kill Hitler? To get the right results, you'd have to say that the rule you are following is something like don't kill except in self-defense or war or when you can kill Hitler or something like that. But as soon as you allow for exceptions, you open up the floodgates. In general, you might say something like don't kill except when it promotes happiness. But now the rule utility is just sanctioning the same actions as act utility was. You could do something similar to justify slavery, using rule utility. A rule like, don't enslave people unless they are of race X, might generate more happiness overall if followed consistently, but that of course would not make it right. A similar point makes it clear that utilitarian calculus is still difficult to do, even when you're dealing with a general rule like in rule utility, because it's hard to know what rule you really are employing by doing a certain action, since you can define your action in so many different ways. Suppose you're considering whether or not you should smoke pot. Are you acting on a general rule that when you have the opportunity to smoke pot, you should? Or a rule that when you have the opportunity to take an illegal drug, you should? Or perhaps the rule that you're acting on is only when I am at this particular party, then I should burn a joint. To get the result you want, it seems you could define the rule many different ways. And the final problem points to one of my favorite notions, the intrinsic value of true belief. Robert Nozick asks us to consider what he calls an experience machine, a machine that you can hook yourself into that would give you a lifetime of pleasurable experiences by generating a false reality tailored to your wishes and desires. Kind of like Descartes' demon, but it's a machine that feeds you experiences. You could live out a fake life in a fake world, all the while believing that it's real, and that world would be whatever you want it to be, and you'd get whatever you want: fame, sex, adoration, a family, success, whatever. Suppose everyone is given the opportunity to plug into this machine. Following the general rule, I will plug into the machine when offered, would definitely produce more happiness overall. Everyone will have almost as much happiness as they can handle. And yet, most would argue that one should not plug into such a machine. Why? Because there's no value in living a false life in a fake world. You would be fooled into believing that world was real and into accepting many false beliefs. But there is something intrinsically valuable about true belief and not being duped that utilitarianism just seems to miss out on. Notice how similar the experience machine is to Plato's cave. Indeed, if ignorance truly is bliss, then according to both varieties of utilitarianism, ignorance should be preferred. But clearly it should not, especially if you're interested in philosophy. You should value true belief. After all, there would be something especially pitiful about a 20-year-old who still believed in Santa Claus, no matter how happy his Christmases were. And don't forget about the pitiful prisoners in Plato's cave. So, perhaps we're looking in the wrong place for our moral truth makers. After all, not all statements that are true are made true clearly by states of the world, like the consequences of actions. Truths of logic, for example, are often not to be found in the world, but are simply true by definition. Everything is identical to itself. If P, then P. Nothing is both true and false. 1 + 1 = 2. So perhaps, since these things are just true by definition, we can look to logic to find the truth maker for moral statements. Simply put, perhaps it is because immoral actions are illogical or unreasonable that they actually are immoral. This was a suggestion made by Immanuel Kant, and we will turn to him in the next lecture as we consider our next question. Does reason define the good? We are seeking the nature of morality, and specifically truth makers for moral statements. So far, we've looked at God's commands and the consequences of actions to try to find the truth makers for moral statements. Although these are not necessarily physical states of affairs, they are, or at least would be, truths about the world. But we have yet to be successful. These theories are subject to fairly serious objections. So perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. Perhaps we should be asking, does reason define the good? This is exactly what the famous 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant thought. Although he believed in God, he did not think God's commands were what made moral statements true. Further, he didn't think the consequences of an action were relevant to whether or not it was moral. He agreed with Hume that you can't get an ought from an is. You can't derive what ought or should be the case from what actually is the case. And so the amount of happiness an action would or would not produce cannot tell you whether or not it is moral or immoral, Kant said. Instead, Kant suggested that reason determines what is moral or immoral. We might say for Kant, it's being unreasonable that makes something immoral. Kant has a very specific way of defining what he means by unreasonable, however, and we'll go over that shortly. But put simply, Kant didn't look to truths about the world to determine right and wrong. He looked instead to truths of logic. In addition, Kant thought that concentrating on the consequences of an action to determine its morality was just too short-sighted. One's intentions and motivations are more relevant. And in fact, the actual outcome may not be relevant at all. If one acts with the right kind of motivation, then one is doing a moral action, even if for whatever reason the action ends up leading to more harm than good. To return to a previous example, if you give to someone in need because you think it's your duty to do so, and it is your duty to do so, then you act rightly, even if it turns out the person does harm with what you gave them. Likewise, the cowardly soldier does wrong by turning and running, even if he incidentally saves the world because he did so. So, Kant argued, any correct moral theory must take your motivations into consideration. Simply put, if you act with the intention of doing your moral duty, which he defines specifically, so we can call it your Kantian duty, then your action is morally right. If you violate your Kantian duty, then your action is morally wrong. And it doesn't matter what the consequences of your action are. All that matters is that you did your duty. This is why Kant's theory, and those like it, are often called deontological theories. Deon is Greek for duty. Now, what is your Kantian duty? Well, according to Kant, there are certain actions that we're obligated to do regardless of the circumstances or consequences. Things like, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't murder, don't commit suicide, don't fail to pay back your loans, develop your natural talents, and help others in need. Actually, Kant divides these into two different kinds. There's perfect duties and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are things that I must be doing at all times. Most of the don'ts fall into this category because they really are things that I can be doing all the time. I'm obeying the don't steal rule right now. Our imperfect duties, on the other hand, are more flexible, like help others in need. I need to fulfill this duty, but I don't have to help everyone in need all the time. That's just not possible. And I don't always have to be doing so. So I can choose to fulfill this duty at different places and times. Now, why are such things our duty? Because they are what we would do if we followed what Kant calls the categorical imperative. That is, act only on that maxim, rule, through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Kant calls it the categorical imperative because you are obligated, it is imperative, to follow this rule regardless of the circumstance or situation, regardless of category. Now, how do we use the categorical imperative? Well, first, you have to identify the rule that governs what you're doing. If you're deciding whether or not to do some action A, the rule will be something like, when I can do A, I will do A. Then you ask whether or not universally following that rule should or even could be done. What would the world be like if everyone did A when they could? If you would not or could not will such a world to exist, then the action is immoral. So there are a couple of things to consider. First is whether you would universalize it. Would you be willing to live in a world in which everyone followed your example? If you would not like everyone else to act as you are about to act, then it is irrational for you to act that way yourself, and thus the act is immoral. Now, don't confuse the categorical imperative with the golden rule. Treat others as you would have them treat you. They aren't the same. The two rules are not the same. Unlike the golden rule, Kant's categorical imperative doesn't depend on how you would want to be treated. So you can't make it okay to lie to someone by saying, oh, I wouldn't care if they lied to me. The categorical imperative depends on what kind of world you would want to live in. In addition, although they may forbid some of the same kinds of actions, like murder, Kant's categorical imperative is much broader than the golden rule. For example, consider developing your talents. It probably doesn't matter to you at all whether or not your neighbor develops his talents. That doesn't even count as a way they are treating you, so the golden rule really doesn't even apply there. But you would not want to live in a world in which no one develops their talents. That would mean no doctors, no farmers, no technology, no music. Nobody would be good at anything, and no one would provide services. Clearly, Kant's categorical imperative demands that we develop our talents, but the golden rule does not. But there's also something else to consider when applying the categorical imperative. Could following the rule be universalized? Would it even be possible for everyone to follow your example? If it's not possible, then you could not will it to become a universal rule, and thus performing the action is irrational and consequently immoral. Not doing such an action is your Kantian duty. Now, in what way could it be impossible for everyone to follow a rule? By the universal following of that rule, making it impossible to follow that rule. The easiest example is murder. Suppose you're furious with someone and the thought flashes through your mind to murder them. What if everyone followed your example, acting on the rule, when I have the opportunity to murder somebody, I should? Well, if everyone did that, there would be no one left to murder, and thus it would be impossible to follow the rule. For this reason, says Kant, following through on your impulse to murder is immoral. It couldn't be universalized. Or what if everyone always lied? Everything everyone said was false. What if that were true? Well, then speech would be meaningless and communication would be impossible. And thus, so would lying be impossible. Universalizing lying is impossible, so lying is immoral. Or what if everyone stole all the time? Well, then property ownership would be meaningless, and thus stealing would be impossible, because you can't steal from someone unless they own something, right? They have to own it for you to be able to steal it. Theft couldn't be universalized, so theft is immoral. So, there are two ways to violate the categorical imperative. A, if you wouldn't want to live in a world in which everyone is acting as you are, and B, if a world in which everyone acted as you are is impossible because it would lead to a contradiction. In either case, you are violating the imperative. Fulfilling either condition is sufficient for making an action immoral. First glance, this seems right. But the categorical imperative leaves something to be desired because it doesn't seem to properly label everything that is immoral as immoral. First of all, you are supposed to consider the universalization of the rule on which you're acting. But Kant isn't clear on how exactly you should formulate such a rule. For example, is killing someone when you're a soldier fighting a war immoral? Well, if the rule that governs your action is kill whenever you have the opportunity, well, then it's immoral. You couldn't universalize such a rule. But if the rule is kill your opponent when fighting a war, well, that rule could be universalized, and thus the action is not immoral. By fine-tuning the circumstances expressed in the rule, you can make it universalizable. But how much fine-tuning is too much? What about kill your opponent when your name is, insert your name here? That rule could be universalized, no problem, without contradiction at all. And you might be perfectly fine with living in a world in which that law or that maxim is universalized, but clearly such an action would be immoral. It's not ethical to make exceptions for oneself. Kant himself would agree, but he never makes it clear how wide or narrow to define or fine-tune such rules. So it seems that the categorical imperative falls short. Or think again of slavery. The rule enslave people could not be universalized. Not everyone could be a slave because if there were no masters, then there can't be any slaves. However, a rule like enslave all people of race X could be universalized without contradiction. And at least if you're not in race X, such a world might be very comfortable to live in. Without specificity about how wide or narrow to fine-tune the rule, by Kant's categorical imperative, it could be moral to enslave a specific race. But clearly, it is not. Now, Kant actually gave us something that might avoid these kinds of objections, but it's not quite clear how well it works. What he did was give us another version of the categorical imperative, one that he believed was just another way of saying the same thing as before, but that clearly didn't allow slavery and exceptions to murder, etc. Any rule that you wouldn't or couldn't universalize, he thought, was disrespecting others, treating them as a means to an end. That's at least one reason to not want it universalized, because doing so would lead you to being treated as a means to an end. So another way he thought of expressing the categorical imperative is this. So here's version 2. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, other persons, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. In other words, you should never act in such a way as to treat a person merely as a means to an end. Persons are valuable in and of themselves. In a way, a human's well-being is a goal in and of itself. Therefore, no one should ever use a person merely as a means to achieve some other goal. Now, that's good advice, and clearly is incompatible with slavery and exceptions to murder. But Kant's error seems to be in his thinking that the first version and the second version of the categorical imperative mean the same thing. Now, neither one of them is the golden rule, treat others as you would have them treat you. Just like version 1, version 2 is not relative to how you would want to be treated. You can't say, well, I wouldn't mind being treated as a means to an end, to make it okay to treat others as that way yourself. You should never treat anyone as a means to an end, regardless, Kant says. Unlike the golden rule, both versions are categorical imperatives. But it doesn't seem that version 1 and version 2 mean the same thing. To see why, consider what it means to treat someone merely as a means to an end. The expression, "you just used me," expresses the objection someone might have when she's treated as a mere tool to accomplish some goal that you have. Using someone for sexual gratification or borrowing money from that someone that you never intend to pay back, even if you intend to use that money for a good purpose, are clear examples of using humans as means to ends. Now, a violation of version 2 can involve a violation of version 1 because it often involves some kind of lie or deception. Maybe you trick someone by deceiving him into thinking, into doing what you want him to do. That involves treating him as a means to an end and doing something you could not universalize. But it doesn't always involve this. For example, as we've discussed, enslaving a particular race is something that could be universalized without contradiction, and so it does not necessarily violate version 1. But slavery is perhaps the prime example of treating someone as a means to an end, so it does violate version 2. So version 1 and version 2 don't seem to mean the same thing, and I think most philosophers agree. Now, I suppose if you were to leave open how to fine-tune your use of version 1 on a case-by-case basis, you could always make sure that following it avoided treating others as a means to an end. And in that way, you could make version 1 and version 2 mean the same thing. Or you could think of the second version as a guideline for how wide or narrow to conceive of the maxim you're considering when using version 1. Although enslave everyone of race X could be universalized, since it would lead to treating others as a means to an end, we could say, well, that's the wrong way to conceive of the maxim that you'd be following by enslaving someone. It's too narrow. The maxim you're actually following should be conceived as something like enslave everyone, well, which can't be universalized. Now, I'm not sure if that's what Kant had in mind by offering up these two versions, but at the end of the day, I'm not that concerned with interpreting Kant correctly. I just want to correct moral theory. So let's consider the suggestion that to determine whether or not something is moral, we should first ask whether we can will our action to be universalized. All right, version 1. And if we can, then we should then ask whether or not doing so would involve treating people merely as a means to an end. If it doesn't, then we can say the action is moral. If this works, we could say that aligning with both versions of the categorical imperative is what's necessary and sufficient for something to be morally good, or at least not morally bad. Now, you might think this is too strict because we can't truly avoid using people as a means to an end. Could we never ask anyone to help us? Isn't that using them as a means to an end? If all such actions were immoral, then all collaborative efforts would be immoral. For example, when I played my badass 10-piece double bass drum kit in the pit band for the Who's rock opera Tommy, my school put it on in the fall of 2014, the director Dave Reynolds asked me to do so as a way to make sure the production happened successfully. So I was used as a means to that end, and thus it would seem that the director violated the second version of Kant's categorical imperative. But actually, he did not, because I wasn't used merely as a means to an end. Read the second version closely. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, other persons, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. It's fine to get someone to help you accomplish a goal, but you cannot use him or her merely as a way to accomplish this goal. You also have to treat the person as an end to themselves, making sure that their humanity is respected. When I was asked to play for Tommy, I was told exactly what it would entail. Hours of rehearsal every day, and an inflexible schedule for over a month, and a commitment to 7 performances at the beginning of October. If, for example, the director had lied to me, said it would only require a couple of rehearsals, a few hours of work, and only one show, to rope me into committing to do it, then he would have been merely using me as a means to an end, as a way to get the show to occur. Instead, he made it clear what it would entail, and I agreed to do it with full consent, and you should have seen it. It was a great show. Generally, you might think of using someone merely as a means to an end as treating them like an animal, as a means of nourishment or as a beast of burden. In fact, this gets to the heart of the reasoning behind Kant's second categorical imperative, second version. The reason that humans should never be treated merely as a means to an end is because they are unique, says Kant, because unlike animals, they are aware of their own consciousness, and more importantly, because they are rational and thus are free to make their own decisions. Only humans can be held morally responsible, Kant says, for what they do. Other creatures are slaves to their nature and their nurture, their biological structure and environment. That determines how they act, but not humans. As Kant says, everything in nature works in accordance with laws. Only a rational being has the power to act in accordance with his idea of the laws. That is, in accordance with principles. And so only a rational being has a will. A rational being can act on what Kant calls impulsions and defy the laws by choice. And as we've seen, for Kant to act morally, we must choose to act in accordance with the categorical imperatives because we recognize that doing such an action is our duty. But this also leads us to the first major objection to Kant. To even talk about morality, we've been assuming that we're free and morally responsible in a compatibilist sense. You recall compatibilism from the lecture on what it meant to be free. It suggests that we could be free and morally responsible even if we are determined to act as we will by outside forces. But Kant's theory of morality seems to assume that we're free in a libertarian sense, as we discussed when we talked about libertarian free will. Kant thinks that we are not caused by outside forces to act as we will, but instead are the ultimate cause of our action, even able to act otherwise. But we've already seen the difficulty in maintaining that we're free in this sense. We're just as subject to the laws as everything else in nature. So Kant's theory has a big hill to climb if it's going to have a full defense. Another problem is what Kant's theory entails about animals. Since they are not rational creatures, Kant says, it is perfectly acceptable to use them as a means to an end. But that seems wrong, at least in some circumstances. Even if using them as beasts of burden and for food is justified to some extent, and that's a whole nother debate, but even if you are not a vegetarian or vegan, you probably think that animals should be treated with some respect. Even if you can use them for work, you can't work them to death. Even if it's okay to eat pigs, it's not okay to keep them in pens so small that they can't even stand up or turn around. And this is because, although they are not rational, they are conscious. They feel pain. Utilitarianism seems to track our intuitions more in this regard. Animals deserve at least some respect because they're conscious and can feel pain, but Kant doesn't respect animals at all. Kant also says some things that many would disagree with when it comes to capital punishment. According to Kant, when someone acts in accordance with a rule, they are showing that they wouldn't mind it being universalized. So if someone murders someone else, then they are showing that they're willing to be murdered themselves. Indeed, if we do not kill them, then we are affirming the killing of innocents, he says. Yet many today think capital punishment is barbaric. The purpose of the government and law is to protect society, and life in prison protects society just as well. Indeed, the US is the last Western first world country to still have capital punishment. Countries that still do this include the likes of Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. The fact that Kant's theory endorses capital punishment is a mark against it in the eyes of many. Another objection, which I think is underappreciated, is simply that Kant gives no argument for his theory. He spends a lot of time telling us why certain actions would be irrational, defy logic, but no time telling us why rationality determines or even serves as a truth maker for moral statements. So what if I couldn't or wouldn't universalize my action? One might insist. It's not going to be universalized, so what does it matter? It's all well and good to say that rationality determines morality, but I have yet to see an argument for why it does. After all, love and care aren't always rational, yet we wouldn't think them immoral. Indeed, because of our love for our family and closest friends, we would likely treat them in ways that cannot be universalized, especially when we show them favoritism. Yet we would hardly think this is immoral. In fact, those who defend feminist ethics suggest that favoring your own family members, even at the expense of others, can sometimes be moral. We'll talk about this a little bit in the next lecture. But before we do, there's one more major objection to Kant that we have to consider. And that is this, that there are no real categorical imperatives. There are no perfect duties. There are no things that I must do regardless of the circumstance. For example, Kant thinks that we have a perfect duty to keep our promises. But you would probably agree that if it's a small promise to a friend and something comes up with your family that is much more important, you wouldn't be doing something morally wrong by breaking that promise. Certainly, if the friend would sympathize, you've not done anything wrong. Indeed, if breaking the promise would save a life, you'd be acting immorally by keeping the promise. Yet Kant would say you have done something wrong because you should always keep your promises. In short, Kant seems to fail to recognize that sometimes consequences are relevant to the morality of an action, especially when the consequences are obvious and negative. But Kant also didn't realize that our duties can conflict, or if he did realize it, he gave us no way to solve the paradox that his theory generates when they do conflict. And this gives rise to perhaps the most famous objection to Kant of all. For Kant, you are obligated to never lie, but also obligated to never murder, or obviously be complicit in a murder. But suppose an axe-wielding murderer comes to your door and asks where your mother is so he can murder her. Do you lie and say that she isn't home, thus violating your duty to always tell the truth? Or do you tell the truth and violate your duty to not be complicit in murder? Obviously, you should lie. But Kant's theory doesn't say you should, or more accurately, it says you should not lie because it is a categorical imperative to never lie, but it also says you should not be complicit in murder, which is also a categorical imperative. So according to Kant's theory, you should lie, and you should also not lie. Contradiction. Clearly, Kant's theory is deficient as it stands. One final problem is that Kant's theory seems to underappreciate other motivations and even the role that emotion plays in moral behavior. If it's your anniversary, your significant other will likely give you a gift. But what would you prefer? That they give you a gift because they love you and are excited about giving you something that you will like? Or simply because they remembered it as your anniversary and know they're obligated to get you something? Obviously, you'd prefer the former. You don't want them to do it simply because they recognize that they should. The same seems to be true for moral behavior. Someone should act morally because they want to, even because they love doing so and desire to do the right thing. They shouldn't do the right thing merely because they recognize rationally that their Kantian duty is to do X and thus that they should do X. But for Kant, that's all that is or should be involved in acting morally: the rational recognition of your duty and corresponding action in accordance with that duty. Interestingly, Kant's theory may have failed to recognize the importance of emotion because Kant himself failed to recognize its importance. Kant was a very rational, by-the-book kind of guy. He lived his entire life in the East Prussian town of Königsberg, and it's often said that the townspeople there set their watches by his evening walk. He was a genius in many respects, knowledgeable in physics and math and geography and all of philosophy. But his writings have such a hyper-rational, many would say convoluted style, that they're almost impossible to understand. In case you didn't notice, as I explained his theory, I didn't spend much time quoting him directly. You very rarely hear philosophers say, and to clarify, let me quote Kant directly. Indeed, J.C. Marchand has theorized that Kant had a frontal lobe tumor that affected his ability to appreciate the importance of emotions and their role in ethical behavior. Reports suggested that Kant suffered from impaired judgment and intelligence that progressed toward dementia, that he lacked social inhibitions and often lost consciousness and even had epileptic fits. He even lost vision in his left eye. The kind of tumor that is responsible for such symptoms could have also impaired his ability to feel and appreciate emotions and could have even muddled the clarity of his writing. So, now we've considered three theories: divine command theory, utilitarianism, and Kant's deontology, none of which have been satisfactory, at least completely. But like before, perhaps this is because we've been barking up the wrong tree. Perhaps we shouldn't be looking for truth makers for moral statements, but instead simply trying to figure out how to act morally. Perhaps we should have been asking, how ought we to live? If we can simply figure out what the right thing is, then we can do it even if we don't know exactly why it is the right thing. But how can we figure out which moral statements are true without knowing what makes them true? In essence, this is the goal of virtue theory, and it's the topic of our next lecture. Our quest for what is morally right or wrong is ultimately concerned with figuring out how we ought to live. Our approach to this problem so far has been to try to answer questions about what actions are morally right and morally wrong, and to find the truth makers for moral propositions about what is right and wrong. At first, this kind of normative approach, as it is usually called, seemed to be the best way to figure out how we should live our lives. By figuring out what makes the obvious moral statements true and false, we can figure out what makes the harder moral statements true and false. Then we can answer those questions in our daily lives and as a result, be good people. But so far, we haven't had much luck. We've considered three major ethical theories: divine command theory, utilitarianism, and Kantian deontology, with a few smaller ones along the way. Each, however, has fallen short. Of course, revising them is still possible, and indeed a rich literature on each exists. But perhaps, like we saw before with theories about the mind and personal identity, we've been going about this all wrong. Instead of determining how to be good by figuring out what actions are right and wrong, perhaps we should be trying to figure out what actions are right or wrong by determining what it takes to be good. Such an approach could be advantageous in numerous ways. For one, we wouldn't have to try to answer every hypothetical ethical question. We could just become the kind of person that can figure out how to behave in ethically problematic circumstances when they arise in real life. Secondly, real life is much more complicated than divine command theory or utilitarianism or deontology would seem to suggest. It seems unlikely that doing what we think God commands, or promoting overall happiness, or aligning our actions with Kant's categorical imperative will always be the right thing to do. Every ethical conundrum is different. But figuring out how to be a good person, well, that would allow us to adjust to every circumstance as it presents itself. This essentially is the suggestion of the virtue ethicists. You do right actions not by figuring out what the right action is and doing it, but by becoming the right kind of person, the kind of person that will perform the right actions, by becoming a virtuous person. The term virtue ethics arose in the mid-1900s in response to shortcomings of the other major ethical theories, deontology and utilitarianism. Divine command theory had largely fallen out of favor. This was most notably due to G.E.M. Anscombe's paper, Modern Moral Philosophy. But what she proposed was not something new. Although the name was new, virtue ethics is actually one of the oldest ethical theories around, a theory that dates back to Plato and was most fervently defended by Aristotle. And it was to these theories that Anscombe suggested that we should return. Virtue ethics suggests that the quest of ethics should be to figure out how to have a good life, and that this can only be accomplished by being a good person. So becoming a good person, should be one's primary concern. And once that's accomplished, good actions will just follow. Generally, the virtue ethicists suggest that there are 3 prerequisites to being a good person.